right. Hi, everyone. This is Amy Peterson. And as Nick mentioned before, if you were on, we're going to go ahead and get started. The webinar today is the role of behavior screening in tiered systems of support. And excited to have this opportunity to share a little bit more about behavior screening, as well as the newest tools chart from NCII. And we're also excited to really share this webinar with the Division for Research as part of CEC's Division for Research. Sorry about that. And we've been doing some partnerships on webinars with that team of researchers to really share some of the work that they've been doing in the field around different areas. Last year we had 2 webinars focused on writing, and then this year we're excited to have Kathleen Lane here to share with us about her work in behavior screening. So go ahead and turn to the next slide. And you can skip one more. So just to start, we'll just share a little bit about the logistics and the format. So if you have any questions or so on, you'll see on your side panel that there's an opportunity to have a question, submit questions. So if you go ahead and submit those questions, we'll see them here on our team. If they're a quick question for us to answer, we'll try and answer them right away. Or if you're having technical difficulties, we'll try and address that right away. And if they're a larger question, we'll hold those to the end and then address them at that time. You'll also see that in the pod, there's a handout section where you can access the PowerPoint slides, and in the chat also shared a link to where the PowerPoint is living on the website and where this webinar will be archived on the website as well. So go ahead and flip over. So I'll introduce Kathleen in just one second, but again, my name's Amy Peterson. I coordinate the communications and collaboration work for NCII at AIR. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share about our work in behavior screening, but really more excited to really have Kathleen Lane, who's a professor in the Department of Education at the University of Kansas, share about her work in behavior screening. So I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen, and she'll share the first section really about an overview of the logistics for screening and behavior, and then I'll share a little bit more about the behavior screening tools chart and the new tools chart on NCII.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate the invitation to be here on representing the Council for Exceptional Children's Division for Research, and I want to thank Nick as well, our man behind the scenes, and great job on the technology for today. So in this time that we have together today, my goal introduction of systematic screening and talking a little bit about the process and the logistics involved in screening, as well as different decision points. And as we launch this conversation today, right now we have 97 people logged on at a very busy time of year and time of the day. And I want to, oops, I'm sorry, it looks like our PowerPoint just went down. I'm going to restart that. I just wanted to thank each person for taking time out of their very busy schedules to come and make this commitment to systematic screening. And when we think about the work that's being done right now in screening, it's very encouraging because up until this point, a large part of our time has been dedicated to focusing on academic screenings rather than also looking at behavior screenings. And so I celebrate the success today of so many professionals that are committed to exploring screening, because it is indeed a priority if we are going to successfully meet students' multiple needs in an integrated fashion. So simply I begin by saying thank you. And if we were to right now take a snapshot of the United States of America and look across today's school systems, you would find that in a picture, you would find about 12% of school-age youth struggle in some form with an emotional or a behavior disorder, either having it or being at risk for it. So about 12% of school-age children struggle in some capacity with moderate to severe challenges. And these are often most noticed by teachers when they are externalizing behavior patterns. So kids that struggle with acting out, non-compliance, and aggression, but also included in that population are honestly the kids that I worry a tremendous amount about, both as a researcher and as a parent. And those are kids with internalizing issues, kids that struggle with being shy, anxious, and socially withdrawn. And in that same picture, looking across our United States schools, you would actually find that 20% of school-age children struggle with mild to severe emotional and behavior disorders. So when you stop and think about this, this is impacting a very large percentage of our student body. And many times, and historically, people have felt that kids with behavior challenges would be supported within the context of special education, according to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, currently dated 2004. But the reality of it is that less than 1% of school-age youth will be supported in special education under the category of emotional disturbance. So when we think about that, that means that most children that are struggling with behavior challenges are going to be supported by our very talented general education team, ideally in partnership with our special education teachers. So our general education teachers are managing a lot in the classroom. Now, the good news, in my view, is that we have now seen a shift to a systems perspective. And as part of that systems perspective, we now have embraced this idea of shifting away from a within child challenge perspective, and instead we are looking at it as, in most cases, a tiered system of support. And as part of these tiered systems of support, we have shifted to this idea that we want to be well prepared to both prevent the development of challenging behaviors as well as learning challenges from happening, and also responding effectively when strategies indeed do occur. And there was a wonderful keynote address made by Michael Uden, who is the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education Programs and Rehabilitation in the United States Department of Education. And this was done in 2014 at the National PBIS Leadership Conference. And he stood up and gave a call to all general and special educators to pay as much attention to students' social and emotional and behavioral needs as we do their academics. And I think this was such a strong move in the right direction. And we've now even seen a greater priority placed on this in terms of recent requests for applications by the Institute of Education Sciences, where people are looking right now for our research leaders across the country to figure out how to best meet kids' multiple needs in an integrated fashion. And I don't think it was ever intended to be this way, but in many school systems, it is still that there's a team of people in a building that are looking at academic data, and they're committed to meeting kids' academic needs. And there's yet another team that is looking at office discipline referral data focused on meeting kids' behavioral needs, and yet still another team of well-intended adults that are looking at meeting kids' social and emotional learning needs. And instead, we want to encourage an approach in which we develop comprehensive and integrated three-tiered models of prevention, which our team refers to as CI3T models of prevention, so that in a district and in a building, there's one integrated approach for meeting students' multiple needs. The triangle that you see in front of you was developed based on work that actually began in 1996 in the West Coast, and it has been developed through partnerships with a number of very highly talented districts and educators and families and students, and we're grateful for the partnerships that we've had. And as part of this, we introduced this model of CI3T to make sure that the base experience for kids, primary prevention efforts, indeed is accessed by all students, including those on an IEP. As part of it, you'd have defined academic roles and responsibilities for students. There's clarity and transparencies made for faculty and staff and families and administrators as well. At the heart of this model is positive behavior intervention and support, following the same guides as the National Center on Positive Behavior Interventions and Support. One difference in this model, however, is that instead of it being just a small group of people defining expectations, we actually have a tool called the SES. It's school-wide expectations for specific settings, and that's a tool in which all adults in the building are surveyed to find out what they believe kids need to know to be successful in meeting expectations in classrooms and hallways, in cafeterias, during arrival and dismissal, etc. And then as part of this model, teams, the CI3T leadership teams in each building, work with their district leaders to make certain that we're addressing our students' social and emotional needs. That's often done by selecting a validated curricula that is actually taught at Tier 1. And rather than that being like a homegrown set of social skills lessons, we work with people to access resources such as SAMHSA, What Works Clearinghouse, and the like, to actually look at the literature to see which particular programs have sufficient evidence to suggest that if implemented with fidelity, they're likely to get the shifts in student performance that they're looking for. Now, in any tiered system, the idea would be that you're going to implement tier 1, which is a primary prevention effort for all with fidelity. And even in the most optimal conditions, we can count on the fact that there will be some students that require tier 2 and tier 3 supports. And I want to be clear that that is not a tragedy. That is an expectation that there will be some students who will need more intensive supports. And we can think about tier 2 supports as low intensity supports and tier 3 as supports reserved for students with the most intensive intervention needs. And when we think about this important work that we're gathered here today to talk about as part of this webinar is accurate detection as to who needs more. And the reason why we start by talking about this idea of working in a tiered system is that there needs to be clarity on what is happening at tier 1, because we want to make sure that when we bring in systematic screenings, we have a very strong source of information about what is taking place at tier 1, and ideally we need to know the fidelity with which tier 1 is happening, because we do not want to be the adults that come in to say your child needs more than tier 1 has to offer when we don't even know what tier 1 is happening or in place. As part of our partnership work with Lawrence Public School Systems, which was funded in a practitioner researcher partnership grant a couple years ago through the Institute of Education Sciences, this very progressive district had the opportunity to help each school in their district build a blueprint that for each school that includes district priorities in academic behavior and social and emotional domains. And it's all intended to meet their board goals of academic excellence, engagement in the community, and equity. So in this blueprints, as part of this planning process that they went through, they started with a blank template, such as the one that you're seeing below, and this is just one element of defining the tier 1 experiences for students. And as part of this planning process, they went on to develop at each school clarity on what's happening at the tier 1 process. So for example, some of it might be, and this is just looking at faculty and staff components, when we think about what we want to have in place, across our school, say for example in elementary school, we want clarity for the faculty and staff on what is the tier 1 experience in terms of students accessing English and language arts or mathematic instruction. As part of this work, educators are taught to prioritize research-based and ideally evidence-based practices so that they can embed proactive strategies within their academic instruction that support students being engaged and minimizing disruption. In terms of behavioral elements, in addition to the idea of positive behavior intervention support that is focused on teaching expectations and allowing students opportunities to practice and receive reinforcement for meeting expectations, we also want to have plans for responding positively and constructively when students do struggle. So these PBIS elements have both the proactive and a reactive component. Many schools base some of their work on how to manage acting out behavior with great lessons that we've learned from Jeff Colvin and Terry Scott and others. And also in these blueprints, there's priorities placed on actually explicitly teaching social skills. So just like we would teach academics, these lessons are taught school-wide, and this is true from preschool to high school, in a way that is allowing every student to have the playing field leveled for them so they get an opportunity to learn some of the soft skills that they need to build self-determined behaviors, to become self-regulated lifelong learners. And so as part of that, there's clarity on what these expectations are at tier 1. Now, once the entire blueprint is built, and again, this is just an element of it, there are plans for teaching tier 1 experiences to all students, all faculty and staff, letting family knows what are taking place, and making sure that administrators are clear in terms of what they need to offer in terms of professional learning and time and other resources to make sure that there's clarity and consistency regarding the tier 1 experience. Another important procedure of this base experience is prioritizing procedures for reinforcement, because part of shaping student behavior is going to be making sure that we're acknowledging the good work that the adults in their building are doing about not even just having these blueprints in place, but implementing them with fidelity and really teaching in a way that fosters this integration. So it might be, for example, in a high school class when they are doing a lesson in a social studies class, that before that conversation begins on a conflict, a time in history, the good, strong educator might pre-correct the students in the classroom to say, you know, we're going to be engaging in some conversations today where people are going to share ideas that may be different from their own. I want to remember that we want to be respectful of other people's ideas. And you might recall from our social skills lessons the importance of showing empathy, and you can remind people of how and why and when to use those different skill sets they're acquiring. And then a third and important piece also of implementation is making sure that we have procedures for monitoring this implementation. Because most of us, the 123 of you logged in at this point, there are plans in place that you want to happen at Tier 1, but you need to know that they are happening, that those are being taught, they're being reinforced, and indeed that they're actually working. As part of this work, before we even think about screening, we want to make sure that we have information on what is happening at Tier 1 in terms of social validity. So when we are implementing a primary prevention effort, we want to have an opportunity for stakeholders to give voice what they think about the goals, the procedures, and the outcomes. As part of CI3T implementation, it is a routine in the buildings that we support that twice a year, faculty and staff actually give input using a tool called the Primary Intervention Rating Scale. And one thing that was a really great lesson learned in 2008 is that we learned that when schools are going through this building process of building their CI3T blueprint, we found that the building's mean scores on this social validity measure actually predicted how well they implemented, which is important. And that leads us to treatment integrity. As part of this model, we want to have actual information to know what implementation looks like in classrooms and in the building. Because if we do not collect information on treatment integrity, then frankly, it's just like a guy talking about his dating life in high school. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. You got to have the data behind that. And when we think about this great work that's being done on behavior screenings, we want to make sure that that is actually prioritizing accurate implementation of screening. And I want to check in right now. I know we've had some tech challenges. I would you, if at all possible, just give me a quick thumbs up if you are able to see this PowerPoint. Okay, thanks for the feedback. As we launch into this discussion of behavior screening, we again want to make sure that we have information on what people think about the goals, the procedures, of the outcomes of what you're doing at Tier 1. We want to make sure that we have implementation on fidelity. And then we want to begin to see how students are responding to this feedback. So as part of that, this is where we enter behavior screenings. And I want to be clear that behavior screenings should not be, the data in my view, should not be analyzed in isolation from these other points of data, because we want to have these multiple sources of information to inform decision-making at the school site. So let's talk a little bit now about behavior screenings in general. When we think about behavior screenings, the first thing I want to make clear is that there are a number of tools available. And we will not have sufficient time today to walk through each tool, but I do want to put it on everybody's punch list to make sure that you take the time to go explore the different options that are there. And when you're looking at screening tools, one of the biggest decisions a district or a school site is going to make is making certain that they're picking a screening tool that has adequate psychometric properties, meaning that it's working to detect the students that you're hoping to support. And secondly, that it is a feasible tool, meaning that it is one that you can implement with procedural integrity and that you can sustain over time. Because just like academic screening tools, you cannot interchange these scores. So when you pick a screening tool, stick with it and implement it. But be cautious in your decision-making process for when you are putting this in place. Now, as for screenings, It is very comparable when doing behavior screenings. It's very comparable to academic screenings in the sense that they happen 3 times a year and you screen every single student. So we're not going with the approach of you think there's a problem, so you screen. You screen as part of primary prevention efforts. So if you have 109 kids in your school or you have 2,000 kids in your school, they are all screened 3 times a year, fall, winter, and spring. Now, there are 2 important distinctions between behavior screenings and academic screenings. First of all is the timing of the fall time point. For academic screenings, like when you're doing things like Ames Web or Dibbles, those screenings can be administered as soon as students return to the school year, like from their summer break. With behavior screenings, you'll need to read the technical manuals for each, but in general, you wait 4 to 6 weeks after the school year begins, and then you screen every student. So the timing is different for fall. The next thing is the fact that doing behavior screenings, as we're talking about today, and there are different types of screenings. There's teacher-completed ones, parent-completed ones, student-completed ones. We're talking about teacher-completed screening tools today, and these teacher-completed tools do not require time with students. So I'm not approaching a student and saying, Grant, are you internalizing today? Or Paloma, tell me how aggressive you're feeling today. Instead, these are independent ratings that are completed by the teacher. And as part of our goal of really respecting teacher time, we encourage CI3T leadership teams to actually calendar out the dates for systematic screenings. And we encourage people to conduct these as part of regularly scheduled faculty meetings so that all adults are there and are able to screen the students. And this is important, that all students that have been there for at least 30 days, have been enrolled for at least 30 days, are screened at each time point. So we do not encourage rolling screening when kids are coming in. Now, there's, as I mentioned, multiple different sources or different options for systematic screening. Some you'll find on the NCII site. I also want to make you aware that on this website, ci3t.org, there's a tab on systematic screening, and there are several YouTube videos and other points of reference, like this little handout. If you wanted to, you can download it. And there's other resources as well. You can find similar products and information on pbis.org as well. But do yourself a favor and do due diligence to make sure that you're looking at the psychometrics and you're looking at who the intended students are to be screened. And at this time, we're starting to really gain some traction. There was for a period of time in the early years, more screening tools available at the elementary than the other levels like preschool or middle or high school, but we're starting to see some breadth of screening schools over time. So if you do have time following this webinar, you might make yourself a note to log into ci3t.org and check out that systematic screening tab. And on that, you'll also find another tab called CI3T in Action. And there are some videos from elementary, middle, and high school school site leaders and district leaders actually, who have been involved in systematic screening. And if you are somebody that is screening in the high school level or the middle school level, one thing I want to just pre-correct for right now, at the elementary level, it's typically the homeroom teacher that does the screening. At the middle and high school levels, it is not every teacher screening every kid in every period. One of the conversations that's had during the planning process is which period, or not like if it's first, second, third, fourth, etc. Which period during the day do you want the screenings to take place? And there are a number of logistical concerns that you want to think about. The biggest being in the high school is you want to make sure you're picking a time when all students are present. And that is more complicated than it sounds, because you have to think about some students being off-site for maybe like taking a college class, or maybe leaving for a vocational experience elsewhere. So in some of the high schools we've worked with, there was only one option. It was fifth period. The period that surrounded lunch was the only time that every student was in the building. So that was their time that they chose to screen. And there are a number of psychometric studies for a whole range of different tools that have been conducted to look at inner rater reliability and test retestability over time, points that Amy will talk about in a little bit in just a few moments. Now, when we think about screening, I want to show you just a few practical examples from actual screening tools. But again, the overarching considerations that you want to have as you're listening to this is you want to make sure that you find something that accurately detects students and something that is feasible for your teachers to do. This is not a committee decision. These are independent ratings. When I think about it being psychometrically sound, and listen to this one piece because this is important, every screening tool is going to have some margin of error. And some of the mistakes that get made are called false positives, which means the screening tool suggests that there's a challenge when in actuality there is not. Now, the consequence of a false positive in screening is that that student gets probably a little extra help. They might get a low intensity support like more instructional choice or check-in, check-out. That is actually not a bad thing because they're getting extra assistance. My concern as a researcher and as a practitioner would be missing kids that did need help, and that is referred to as a false negative. So when you're trying to pick out a screening tool, you want to minimize you want to have a fine balance there, but we want to make sure that we are not overlooking kids that need actual assistance. And there's more information on that on the websites. Now I'd like to shift for just a couple minutes and talk with you about some of the screening tools that are out there. I'm just going to feature two. It's not that I'm saying these are the best in the world, but I am saying these are ones that we've interacted with faculty and staff with and worked with different districts on. And I do want to start with the systematic screening for behavior disorders. The second edition came out from Hill Walker and his colleagues in 2014. And in my view, I actually do view this to be like a gold standard for systematic screening. There are currently two different versions of this when you purchase this very reasonable kit. There's a pre-K and K version, and then there's a 1st through 9th grade version. Now, you'll notice that these data in front of you, these are older data, and I want to show you these specifically because I want to make it clear screening is not new. Screening has been around for a while, and it is gaining traction in schools, but we also want you to know that there is still room to grow. So as we're thinking about screening, I want to walk you through how this is used. So these are data from an actual elementary school. And on the left-hand side of that dotted line that you see, you'll see 3 blue bars. So they screened in winter in 2007. And when they did this screening with the SSBD, and this is a tool that begins with nomination and rank ordering. So essentially, there's a definition for externalizing, like more boisterous, acting out, non-compliance, aggressive, being defiant. And teachers rank order kids from most like to least like on that particular dimension. And in the first version of this, they took their whole classes and sorted them into most like externalizing or most like internalizing, and then they ranked order them from most to least. In the current version, teachers read definitions, and then they pick the top 5 students whose characteristic behavior patterns most closely match externalizing. And then they rank order them from 1 to 5. The top 3 kids pass through that first gate, and then teachers fill out extra information on just those 3 students. And there is some flexibility, so if you feel like there's a 4th or a 5th student that really does need to be considered further, you can pass them through that first gate, but it is a minimum of 3 students. So they fill out 2 tools, one called the Critical Events Index and one called the Combined Frequency Index. And in this particular graph, when you look at 2007, there were 60 students that passed through those first gate. There were 13 of those students who exceeded normative criteria. That means they had higher than average acting out behavior. And that represented 6%, actually 6.18% of the entire school. Now you look at the next winter time point, so it's a year later. So remember, your kindergarten kids have moved up to 1st grade, your 5th graders have gone on to middle school. And now that school grew, so their enrollment increased. So now there were 69 their number of kids screened that were passed through that 1st grade increased to 69 because there was an extra teacher added. And of those 69 students that passed through the first gate, there were 7 that exceeded normative criteria, which leaves us with 3.5% of the entire student body as having more than average externalizing behavior. And that stayed pretty stable that next year. Now, when you think about this, it's creating transparencies as to who might need extra assistance. So if I'm a school psychologist or a social worker, rather than going to a teacher and saying, do you have anybody that needs any help, I can use screening data to help connect kids to supports. To the right of the dotted line, I see the same thing with internalizing behavior patterns. So at the same time in winter 2007, when kids were screened in that building, again, 60 kids passed through that first gate. There were 17 students, which represented almost 9% of the student body, that had higher than average internalizing issues. So the next year, even though the school grew, when they again screened, the percentage of kids that had internalizing issues was decreasing. And you see a pretty steady decrease in that. But remember, this is not a randomized control trial, so you shouldn't draw any causal conclusions. This doesn't say that implementing NCII caused this, because this is just descriptive information. But by screening, this gives me a picture of what's happening in terms of overall risk in a building, and it allows me to look to see which specific school kids might need additional support. And this is a very low-cost screening tool. Another screening tool that was originally developed in Oregon was developed by Tom Drummond in 1994, and it was referred to as the Student Risk Screening Scale. And our colleagues, with permission from Tom Drummond, added some additional items to begin expanding the use of this tool to also detect kids that had not just acting out, but also more of the internalizing issues. So there is now this tool called the Student Risk Screening Scale. It's referred to as the SRSSIE for internalizing and externalizing. And this is just 12 items. And teachers, again, independently look at each student's behavior, and they rank order. There's no rank ordering here, but they simply score students using a 4-point Likert type scale, in which teachers indicate anywhere from never, occasionally, sometimes, and frequently, with which students demonstrate these specific behaviors. Now, in this particular screening tool, there are 2 total scores that are created. I'm going to focus over here for just a moment on the elementary side. So at the elementary level, items 1 through 7 are added up, and if a student's total score is 0 to 3, they're considered in the low risk category. A student's score of 4 to 8 is considered at the moderate risk category, and 9 to 21 is at the high risk category. The other 5 items are those that are reflecting internalizing behavior patterns. And you'll notice here that the range is really low for low risk. So 0 to 1 is low risk, 2 to 3 is moderate, and 4 to 15 is high, which means you need very little internalizing issues to suggest that there's a concern. And on the right-hand side, you'll see preliminary cut scores on the middle school level. And I want to mention something about the middle school, which also complements Tom Farmer's work quite nicely. We've actually learned that peer rejection actually becomes more characteristic of internalizing issues as kids move into the middle and high school year. So it's important to note that it's the same 12 items completed for all students at the elementary level, middle, and high school, but how they're scored in the middle and high school is different than how they're scored at the elementary. And I want to show you now, these again are data from real school screening. These are from an elementary school. They screened for the first time. This was fall 2014, 2015, and 2016. And this is the first 7 items on the internalizing issues. And what you'll see over time is that the percentage of kids scoring in the low risk category increased to just over 80%. So it's like 82%. And that is our target goal, is to have that be moved to about 80%. And when we look at that yellow scores, we're looking there at students scoring in the 4 to 8 range. So those are like suggesting moderate risk. And then the percentage of students in the red at the top is also shrinking. Again, same messaging about please don't draw causal conclusions, because these are just descriptive data. But we see this trend time and again. Here's the same school and looking at their internalizing issues. So again, green bars are getting larger, and the percentage of kids in the yellow is getting smaller, as is the percentage of kids scoring in the red range. And again, this allows you to be able to get an objective measure in terms of screening for soft signs of challenging behavior. And then these data can be used in several ways, 3 of which I want to highlight here for you now. And so I'll just do this briefly so we have time to talk a little bit more about how the evaluation of these tools looks. But whether it's the SRSS or the SSBD or the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire, the SABRS, any of them, you want to make sure that you're looking at your data through multiple lenses. So one of the first things we encourage people to do is take a snapshot of their school as a whole. These are data from a school on the East Coast, and this is from the Social Skills Improvement System Performance Screening Guide. And this screener gives you information on reading skills, math skills, pro-social behavior, and motivation to learn. Now, these data suggest it's actually not close yet to 80% of the students scoring in the low risk category. And I give total props to this principal. They had reached out for support, feeling like they needed help with tier 2 and tier 3 supports. But when we looked at their screening data that they were collecting, you see very clearly that this challenge at that school is not a tier 2 issue. If you have that many kids screening in at tier 2 and tier 3, then we have a challenge with core, which means we need to start by intervening at tier 1 so that we can create a base learning experience for students. That is very different than this middle school. And this school started screening in 2004, and they used the student risk screening scale developed by Tom Drummond. And you see over time from 2004 to 2011, those green bars getting bigger over time. So the percentage of students in the low risk category were increasing over time. And I do want to point out in 2008, I always feel like it's like those weight loss commercials that says less than 1%. Those results are not typical. Most schools would have about 3 to 5% of their student body screening in the high risk category. Now, about next year in 2009, when their risk increased a bit, what they did is they went back and they looked at their treatment integrity data, and they realized that through the years, as they had been implementing CI3T, they had hired new teachers, and they realized that they hadn't onboarded them in a way that gave them enough training with what the tier 1 experiences are. So they did a booster session, and then we again saw shifts in student performance. And I mention this because we want to be looking at multiple sources of data in tandem. That is also true in terms of how we want to look at student data with not just behavior screening, but other data. So for example, these are hypothetical kids, so these are not actual student names, but this is a summary of their reading, math, their SRSS E7, which is the acting out, their internalizing, office discipline referrals, and absenteeism. And we encourage you to look at multiple sources of data together, because you will see things like you see here. If you were to look across some of these rows of data, when a child is struggling behaviorally, we also want to look at other important indicators, like are they struggling to read? Are they struggling with numeracy? And I really encourage you to start by looking at your attendance data. School is 100% a must be present to win game. And so if kids are not coming to school, it is not surprising to us that they're struggling. And some kids may act out to get out because it is too difficult or it's too easy. And in some kids, you know, if we were relying only on office discipline referral to detect which kids need more, frankly, we would miss kids with internalizing issues. Now, I want to mention, like, if this was actually my classroom as a former 5th grade teacher, if that's what my data looked like for my student body, I'm not going to start by putting all kids into tier 2 into tier 3. I'm going to begin by looking at simple shifts that I can make in how I'm teaching to support engagement and minimize disruption. So I might employ strategies like active supervision or instructional choice or pre-correction. And there's more you can read about. CEC's Division for Research a few years ago put out a whole research-based strategies for improving behavior in schools. There's other books that operationally define these, and there's free access professional learning materials to go with many of these strategies on ci3t.org if you click on the professional learning tab. And it might also be, if it is a smaller percentage of students, then I might want to do something where I am connecting a student to a tier 2 or a tier 3 support, a point that I want to mention now. Another huge benefit of doing screening is it allows you to look at your tier 1 practices. It allows you to think about how you can empower teachers by putting more tools in their toolkits to better manage challenging behaviors in the classroom. And then lastly, I can use this information to connect students to tier 2 or tier 3 supports. In our CI3T work with schools, we help school sites to actually make a grid similar to what you're seeing here that actually lists out secondary tier 2 intervention grids. And over time, our goal is to make sure that these are evidence-based practices. And in these grids, you name the support, and please remember, a support is not a person, it's what the person does. There's a description of it, and now here's the game changer. Instead of it being teacher nomination to connect a student to a support, it would be the screening data that would be used to connect them to these additional supports. And the same is true for kids requiring intensive intervention efforts. And it's not that a student needs to go always from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3. There are absolutely times when they'll go directly to tier 3 based on the level of intensity. To give you a closer look at a tier 3 support, you might look at a functional assessment-based intervention, and there's clear entry criteria as to for whom this might be a good idea. And then anytime we're doing something extra with students, any tier 2, any tier 3, we want to have parent permission or at a minimum inform parents. And then you still need to know 3 things. Is it happening? Treatment integrity. We want to know sociability. Are people on board with the goals and the procedures and the intended outcomes? And then we need to have a reliable a way of measuring if it's working. And then so that it doesn't become like the Hotel California where kids are put in these interventions and left there forever, there has to be an exit criteria. And so I show you these just briefly as a thumbnail overview of screening. Screening is important. It allows you to get multiple looks at what's happening in your building. For anybody who's written a school improvement plan, these are very valuable data. They need to be dealt with securely though. We would not ever email data that had screening. We would want to make sure that how you're sharing it is appropriate to protect each individual's personal rights. We want to make sure we're aggregating, as I've shown you in some places. You want to make sure that the appropriate people have the total scores. I want to emphasize that the decision making is not made based on item level data. It is based on the composite score. So it's important to learn more about each tool. And then as you're collecting screening data, you want to make sure that you have appropriate coaching material so that it is set up for success, so that it is administered correctly. And on that same website, on ci3t.org, you will find coaching protocols for both the district level and the school site level. But again, I just want to thank you so much for considering screening. Accurate detection as to who needs more is indeed an important step. And now we're going to turn it over to Amy, who's going to share with us a little bit about the NCII's behavior screening tools charts and conclude with an opportunity for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Kathleen. So again, we're going to start with just talking a little bit about giving you a little bit of context on NCII, and then jumping into the tools charts, and then jumping into the behavior screening chart specifically. I'm going to spend the most time on the behavior chart specifically because there's other places to learn more about both kind of NCII and what we're doing, and as well as a little bit about the history of the chart. So Kathleen, if you want to flip to the next slide. One of the things that we're really thinking about for NCII is this idea of supporting students with the most intensive needs. It's really our mission of this work, and really working with states and LEAs and schools and universities and practitioners and others to really support that implementation. And one of the things that Kathleen really mentioned, and that we're also really focused on, is that integration of academics and behavior, and making sure that we're thinking about that. And we also are really focused on looking at, if you want to click 2 times, we can pull up those bubbles that are on the screen. This intensive intervention being driven by data, and then really thinking about the increased intensity and individualization of the supports for students with the most intensive needs. So that's really how we see intensive intervention. Targeted for students that have the most severe and persistent learning needs, and really this combination of data and intensification. And the process NCII uses is DBI. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on DBI, but I will reference you to a lot of resources on the website to really get more information. There's a self-paced learning module and a number of other tools and resources, so you can learn a lot more there. But it's really, again, really integrating that data piece and that intensification and adaptation of interventions to better meet student needs. And as we mentioned before, it's really integrated in an MTSS and also in the special education services that were provided to students. So really thinking about where intensive interventions fit. But as we're focused on in this session today, we're really looking at that role of screening and what does screening look like, and why are we talking about screening? So as Kathleen mentioned, we're really thinking about screening in the context of tiered systems of support and all of the resources that we're providing there, as well as the idea that oftentimes our interventions provide kind of a package of assessments. And so we might be looking at screening and progress monitoring and other assessment data, and screening is just one of the pieces in that. But we want to make sure that that screening, that a really important screening piece, is part of that conversation. And as Kathleen also mentioned, there's increasing research around the idea that we can fast track students. Oftentimes, if students have that very intensive need, we might be able to use some of that information to help them get to the supports they need sooner. So a little bit about the history of the charts. You can see kind of them growing over time. And so we started off with some charts around academic progress monitoring in the Student Progress Monitoring Center. At the center in RTI, the National Center in Response to Intervention, we added academic screening and academic intervention. And then under NCII, as I mentioned before, this importance of behavior was also a really key factor. And so we've decided to expand the charts to really look at behavior as well. So you'll see the addition of behavior progress monitoring, behavior intervention, and now behavior screening. I'll also note that the academic screening chart got moved over to the NCII website this year as well to enhance that connection that we were just talking about the importance of screening. As a little bit of background about the charts, one of the things that I really wanted to iterate was the idea that they are done as reviews of resources and tools. And as Kathleen mentioned, there's a lot of resources and tools out there. And so really providing you with a review of those resources. And a technical review committee reviews the technical adequacy of those tools. And we'll look at some of those components in just a second. And then we'll go ahead and think about some of the other factors as well, and looking at those different criteria and information that's available. The charts only include tools that have been submitted for review, so they are not comprehensive. So they provide information about tools that have been voluntarily submitted. So if you don't see a tool that you're using on the chart, and some of those tools that Kathleen mentioned are not on the behavior chart, we'll see that in just a second yet, they might not have been ready to submit at that stage. We're hoping they'll submit in the future. But one of the things that we have seen over time, oftentimes, is just putting out the charts on this information and being able to capture this information for users really helps to drive the field in providing this information and resources. So currently we only have one tool up on the behavior screening tools chart. Again, that does not mean that there's only one behavior screener out there. It is the one that was submitted for that first annual review, and we're hoping that more will be submitted in the future, but this really provides a flavor for the kinds of information that is on the chart. So you can go ahead on the next slide. So as we think about screening, what do we think about for NCII's definition of screening? And these are really the kind of pieces that are really focusing our conversation here. So we're talking about classification accuracy, we're talking about reliability, we're talking about validity. How are we using that information to identify students who require intensive supports, both academically on the academic side, as well as some social, emotional, and behavioral needs on the behavior tools chart? The charts themselves include 3 different tabs, again, really matched to that definition. One on classification accuracy, one on technical standards, the next on usability features, and they all have this similar legend that you can see up on the screen. So there's information about whether there's convincing evidence that was submitted, partially convincing evidence, or unconvincing evidence. And one thing we'll also see sometimes is that the data is not available, and that means that maybe that piece hasn't been studied yet. They weren't able to submit that information. Hopefully it will be submitted in future reviews, but that bar there shows that information. So go ahead on to the next chart. So the first tab is the classification accuracy tab, and this is where we're really getting to that idea that Kathleen was mentioning around the errors, right? So really making sure that we're identifying the right students, and thinking about the sensitivity and the specificity of the tool to make sure that we aren't missing students, that we're not over identifying students, but also not under identifying students. So that's what we're really thinking about when we're thinking about our classification accuracy. And one of the things that you can see up here, again, Kathleen mentioned that you often screen, and we should screen in the fall, winter, and spring. And so on the charts, you see information reported for a fall, winter, and spring measure, the criterion and the classification accuracy for that. You can click on the headers in any of these charts, both on this tab as well as on the classification accuracy tab, to see more about the specific definitions of each of those tools that are used to rate each of those indicators. So if you're interested in learning more, for example, on this tab about what reliability is, if you click on the link under reliability, you'll learn about the definition that the reviewers use for reliability. And then you can also see up at the top, you can see which tab you're on by that orange indication there. Here you're on the technical standards. You can flip back over and click on classification accuracy and so on. So under the technical adequacy, we're thinking about the reliability, validity, and so on. Under usability, it's where we get into some of those ideas about administration format. How do we do this screening measure? Is it individually? Is it as a group? How long does it take? How is scoring occurring? What decision rules do we have available? And was a usability study conducted or not? So that gives us some good information there about the usability of the chart, or of the screening measure, I mean. And go on to the next one. The charts are also all interactive and have a lot of information on there. So if you click on the header as the title for the tool, you can learn a lot about the implementation information, the cost, the training requirements, the different types of support that is available, the contact information for the vendor, and so on. And we really encourage you, if you have specific questions about a specific tool, reach right out to the vendor and ask them those questions. They often have a lot more information. And then we can also click on any of the bubbles on the chart themselves to learn more about the data that was submitted to the reviewers for review. So you can see how those ratings were conducted and the background data that was used for those reviews. So again, all of this chart is interactive to really gather that initial information about what was used for the review. We've also included on all of the charts now an advanced filtering feature, and that allows you to really get down to the nitty-gritties of finding tools and resources that really meet your needs. Of course, on the behavior screening chart with only one tool at the moment, that's not really as critical, but as more tools get added, you might really want to filter down to specific resources, and so this advanced filtering will allow you to do that. And another piece that's up there is just the ability to print out any of that information that's on the chart. So if you're going to a meeting and you want to have that in front of you and you might not have a computer, you can go ahead and click on that print chart feature. But one of the things that I wanted to emphasize again was we always are looking to improve the number of tools and resources that are on the chart, because they're only as helpful as the information that's there for you. So currently there's a call for behavior and academic screening that is open now through the end of the month, through September 25th. And so vendors can submit for reviews of the chart. And so then those tools will be added to the chart during the next review cycle. So if you have a question about a specific screener, you want a specific screener to be reviewed for the chart, we definitely encourage you to tell the vendor that so that they will be encouraged to submit their resources, and so that we have more resources out there for you to look at and review. And up here are just some links to the other tools charts that are available on the center site. Again, we have one on academic screening, one's on both academic and behavior progress monitoring, and academic and behavior intervention as well. So again, all structured very similarly, so you can get similar kinds of information about tools, but with different review criteria that the different folks looked at. So I realized that was a quick overview of those charts, and we welcome any questions. If you have questions, submit them to the NCII email box at any point, but I'll also pull up the question pod here and see if we have any questions that have come in specific to either of the two presentations. So one of the things, Kathleen, that I saw in the list was just an idea of expanding on the idea of social validity. So I'm wondering if you want to just share a little bit more about what you were talking about when you were thinking about social validity, as I look at and see if there's some other ones as well. And Kathleen, we might have you on mute, so you might want to unmute yourself.
Okay, as you think about social validity, one of the things that you want to think about is basically getting people's input on the screening tool that they're about to use. So oftentimes schools, when they have narrowed the choices down to perhaps 2 different screeners, we've worked with several school systems where they have shortlisted 2 different screening tools that they're interested in exploring, and they'll actually have their entire group of students screened using both screening tools. So for example, in some of the earlier studies that were done, you saw schools have used the SSBD, the Systematic Screening for Behavior Disorders, and the Student Risk Screening Scale. So teachers get an opportunity to test out and explore both screening tools. So part of the things that they typically look for are the amount of time that it takes, the reliability and validity, as you've already talked about, but also the functional utility of the tool. There are wonderful tools like the BASC 3 BESS and the SIS Performing Screening Guide that also carry companion intervention materials. And so if schools are resourced such that they can screen and then also have access to a family of tools to support using those data, that may impact teachers' views of it. Some people might have input on screeners that take a longer period of time. Cost is certainly a factor. Some screening tools are free access, and others that are not necessarily free, in the sense that they require personnel time, but there's no monetary cost. Like, for example, the Strength and Difficulties Questionnaire, the Student Risk Screening Scale, and the SRSSIE, those are all free access tools that you can get. You, of course, still need to build district systems that support them. But we want to be cautious of not adopting and implementing a screener that cannot be sustained, because even if it's wonderful, if people think it is too cumbersome to either complete it or score it or interpret it, they're less likely to sustain it.
Great, thanks so much. And one other question we got was about the availability of some of the tools and resources, and just particularly some of the early kind of screenshots that you had on some of the resources that you use. And are those all available on the CIT3 site? And is that the best place for people to look?
Yeah, on ci3t.org, and they're all free access, so please help yourself. Some of the tools that were up there, like the handout on like the comparison of different screening tools that are available, you can find that under a resource on building your CI3T model. There are coaching protocols to help districts make decisions as to which screening tool to pick and then how to install it, and that's on the screening tab. And then there's also resources on the professional learning tab. So when we were talking about what to do with your screening data, it's like if their screening suggests that more than 20% of the kids in their classrooms are struggling, a teacher's first line of defense often is to adopt a new strategy that they can use. And in many of the buildings that we support, principals will support adults in the building becoming on-site coaches for how to do behavior-specific praise, or how to do active supervision, or how to do instructional choice. And there's little how-to PowerPoints, like step-by-step processes to do that strategy and implement it with fidelity, so that you can make sure that teachers are getting the strategies they need along with the professional learning and the on-site coaching to make that happen. But yes, that's all on that website. And there's others as well. Like you could go to pbis.org, and there's a number of free resources available from the National Center there as well too.
Great, thanks so much. Well, I don't see any other questions. The one other one that I just wanted to make sure, I think we answered it in the question and answer, but make sure that everyone got, and Kathleen confirmed that she was talking about Jeff Colvin, and I can put that into the chat for everyone in case you haven't had a chance to see that as well. But when she was mentioning some folks, we just had some clarification on that name. And unless I have missed any, I think we have gotten most of the questions, but if there's any other ones, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. And if not, we really appreciate you guys taking the time out of a busy Wednesday. We know it's the start of the school year, and that's always a challenging time for folks, but we really appreciate you coming on board and hope that you're coming on board with screening if you're not doing it already. So thank you so much, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, and thank you. And Amy, thanks to you and Nick today. And I apologize to everyone for the challenges regarding the technology. If you do have questions that you didn't feel comfortable posing to the group, my email is Kathleen, Kathleen .Lane, Lane, like a little street, at ku.edu. So again, our sincere thanks and have a great afternoon.
And just one question I see coming in about when the webinar will be posted. We do our best to post it within the next day or so. It will depend a little bit if we have any technical challenges, but it should be up in a day or so on the NCII website at that link that I shared at the beginning of the presentation. So hopefully just by the end of the week at the latest, it should be up and ready for you.
Thanks Amy. Thanks, Nick. You guys have a great day.
Bye-bye. Bye.